So here's something strange. Human minds in their current form have existed for about 250,000 years without ever seeing a photograph, without ever seeing a painting, without ever seeing a screen. And yet, when you look at a flat image, you experience an entire world. And that should not work, but it does. And today we're going to try to figure out how. So, this all again is in service of trying to understand that weird and wonderful thing that we call the human mind. And today we're going to see the ability, which is something that is really rather marvelous when you really try to think about how this could possibly be. But we're going to see about the human mind's ability to enter spaces and perceive spaces that do not exist in a picture, and also our sort of first glimpse of the human mind to be able to look back in time and through pictures perceive worlds that haven't existed for centuries. All of this is just something that oftentimes passes as being completely mundane and maybe trivial. But when you really start to think about what that entails, it gives you an indication of just how weird and wonderful your human mind actually is. And again, we're going to focus today on picture perception. So, the perceiving of pictures and being able to interpret what is in that image, the ability of an artist to designate something into that image, and how exactly does that relationship come about. So, we're just going to do a brief recap on why we study picture perception, and then we're going to dive into what is a picture. And I'm really excited to hear about some of your ideas for exactly how do we define a picture, because as we're going to encounter today, it's not as straightforward as you might think. So, pictures are something where everybody knows one when they see it, but then when you try to define exactly what it is, all of a sudden things get a little bit more confusing. So we'll go through three good definitions and one bad definition. And then we're going to have a final objection to this, which is metaphoric images and the challenges that they bring to those definitions and theories about pictures. So, again, one of the big reasons to study picture perception, other than it's a behavior that we can do, and we do want to have a complete understanding of human psychology, it is a very challenging test of perception theories. So, if you ever come across a new perception theory and you immediately just want to know, does it break? Is it able to accomplish human vision in general? Just ask what happens when you show it a picture. What happens with that theory when you give it a picture? And the reason is because our visual system was not made to perceive pictures, and yet we can. So it's this test case that's outside the realm of our everyday experience. It's almost like a living real world experiment that anybody can do. And again, this is the idea that our visual system has been evolving for eons, and our mind as Homo sapiens was basically finished back about 300,000 years ago. And yet, our earliest cave paintings that we have evidence for is about 50,000 years ago. So, this mind that we had existed for 250,000 years without ever seeing an image. And yet, when images came along, they were interpretable, they were perceivable, and we still use them today, just showing how effective that they are. So the idea is that because our visual system was not made to perceive pictures, that picture perception had to piggyback on some already existing visual systems, on some already existing visual abilities. And what that means is that because it's not a separate kind of module that was developed, it's not a separate representation or strategy that is in our mind that developed for pictures, it has to have piggybacked on something that we can already do, which means that if you are again trying to explain vision, it has to explain picture perception. So that makes picture perception one of those great tests for visual perception theories. And as we saw last time when we were taking a look at some of these pictures that the children of Sunningdale School from Sunderland drew, pictures are very mysterious in their ability to depict objects. So representational pictures, pictures that depict things that actually exist, can work with even just the minimal ability or realism in the photo, so or in the picture. So here we have a tiger. Everyone in this class last time identified this as a tiger. Here we have an image of a soccer game. Everybody in class identified this correctly as a soccer game. And then here we have an image of something. So it's not as if pictures have no limits in terms of what they can or cannot depict. Sometimes you try to depict something in a picture. This artist tried to designate a reality into this two-dimensional medium, and we are unable to interpret that out of that designation. And then we didn't get to this part last time, so this is, we'll pick it up here. So not only is this a picture of a tiger, but picture perception and visual theories has to explain why we are able to recognize this as a tiger, and we are able to recognize this as a tiger, and we're able to recognize this as a tiger. And if you really want to stretch the theories of perception, you can also ask, why is it that when you show this to most people, they will say, oh, that's a tiger, rather than, oh, that's a severed tiger head? So we're not going to get into that one, but I'm just going to drop that one in there because there is a phenomenon that seems to be reserved for pictures where part of an object can stand in for the entire object. And that's another type of metaphor. We're not going to touch on that one specifically, but any theory of picture perception would have to be able to explain why all four of these look like tigers. So the easiest one to explain will be that realistic looking photograph of a tiger. And we're going to see that the first viable definition that we have will explain exactly that tiger, but it breaks down if you can't explain the other three tigers depicted here. And we're going to see this time and time again, that pictures can come in many different formats, many different styles, and yet they depict the same thing, whether they're realistic or whether they're not realistic. And then we're going to touch on this a little bit and then dig into it a little bit further when we talk about metaphors. But pictures do have some sort of weird quality to them where they are, in a sense, depicting reality, but in another sense, they're not real. So this is the Treachery of Images by René Magritte. And Magritte really loved playing around with the limits of pictures. So in French, that says, that is not a pipe. And one of my favorite explanations of this Treachery of Images comes again from Scott McCloud in his Understanding Comics book. And we'll just go through the panels here. So he has a depiction of the Treachery of Images. And fair enough, he says, here's a painting by Magritte called The Treachery of Images. The inscription is in French. Translated, it means, this is not a pipe. And indeed, this is not a pipe. This is a painting of a pipe, right? Well, actually, that's wrong. This is not a painting of a pipe. This is a drawing of a painting of a pipe. N'est-ce pas? Nope, wrong again. It's a printed copy of a drawing of a painting of a pipe. Actually, it's a projection of a printed copy of a drawing of a painting of a pipe. That's my little addition. And he goes on, he says 10 copies actually, 6 if you fold the pages back. And what he's referring to there is the serial nature of comic books. There's actually 10 images of Magritte's Treachery of Images there. But if you are one of the readers who likes to fold back their paperback books, you're only looking at 6. And then finally he says, do you hear what I'm saying? If you do, have your ears checked because no one said a word. Actually, have your ears checked because I don't sound like Dr. Yurichevich. So pictures are weird. They're just something that is almost massively magical about them. And that's where we're going to hand it off to everyone here when let's have a little bit of a discussion, a little bit of a speculation. Last time I asked you if you could come up with your own definition of what is a picture. So does anybody have any ideas, any attempts? Yep.
I wrote mine down. I said, a picture is a visual representation of an external reality, stimulus, or experience that has specific meaning to its creator.
Okay, so we have visual representation. So it's a visual medium. Okay, what was the next part?
Representing an external reality, stimulus, or experience.
Okay, so external reality, stimulus, or experience. So that would cover realistic pictures as well as abstract emotional ones. Okay.
And the picture has specific meaning specifically to its creator.
So it has specific meaning to the creator. Okay. So we have kind of three criteria. It's a visual, it's depicting something that's either realistic or an experience or a feeling, and then it has specific meaning to the creator. Okay. Any other suggestions? Yep.
Just a set of patterns that it's the world around it, or not particularly the world around it, but in a 2D more.
Okay, so a set of patterns that imitates.
The world in a 2D format.
Okay, imitates the world in a 2D format. So let's dive into that one a little bit more. What do you mean by imitates?
It tries to replicate how we see the world around us into a 2D format.
Okay, so replicating the world around us, that would account for realistic images. Okay, and how might you account for non-realistic images?
It's a set of patterns that tries to imitate it. It doesn't necessarily mean just photorealistic patterns, just things that we pick out from individual things to identify them.
Okay, so it imitates it, which means that it basically stands in for that thing. And then there's different levels of how much it imitates. And there's some pattern that is probably like a minimum amount that you need. And below that, if it does not imitate it, then you would not consider it a picture by your definition. But if it does imitate it, then you would consider it a picture. Okay. All right. Any other ideas? Yep.
I don't have it like precise, but if
Sure.
you follow back like picture, probably root words depict. So I imagine it's a depiction of a certain perspective of a moment, whether realistic or depiction of what sucks or creations.
Okay. So we have a depiction of either a real world moment or maybe somebody's thoughts or maybe somebody's, what was the last one? Was emotions? Okay, but we have some sort of idea of a depiction, which is, I think you're absolutely correct, the root of both picture and depiction. So we're trying to get something on a two. You didn't mention 2D, did you? So we're trying to get something on a surface that basically triggers that recognition in somebody else. Okay. All right. Any other ones there? Any other speculations? Okay, so those were all actually way better than I did in grad school, as we're going to see in just a moment. But one of the things that I want to just kind of really quickly mention is when you have theories like that, or when you have definitions like that, one of the best things that you can do is just start to ask, well, does this count? And does this count? And does this count? So we did that one for yours where we said, well, if it is recognizable, then it counts. But if it's not recognizable, then it doesn't count. And one of the things that you will oftentimes find is that researchers will disagree on things that are definitional, and that is completely fine. So another researcher might say, well, it's still a picture, even if you can't recognize it, or if nobody can recognize it. So that picture that we showed from the Sunningdale School kids that nobody could recognize, somebody might still say, well, it's a picture. You can't recognize it, but it's still a picture. And you quite justifiably might disagree and say, no, that's actually not a picture. So it's always important, and one of the reasons why we go through definitions like this, it's always important to know that if you're arguing about definitions, be very aware that you're arguing about definitions. And then really the only way to settle that is to go out oftentimes and actually test in a real world environment. Do these things work? Do they not work? And kind of get into some of the more borderline cases of that. But this is the kind of work that they did, Gibson did, Goodman did. It's the kind of work that I tried to do back in grad school. So those are all, as I said, much better definitions than I started with. So let's get to the definition that I had. And this was one of those moments I remember where my supervisor, John M. Kennedy, presented me with this exact challenge. He said, well, try to think of what a picture is, come in with a definition. And I walked in feeling great. And I walked out, well, no. After I said it, and he pointed out why it was no good, I walked out feeling bad. No, I didn't walk out feeling bad. I felt bad. But Dr. John M. Kennedy is the kind of guy that does not leave his students feeling bad. So I will say at the end of every single lab meeting I ever had, whether I was brilliant or whether I was completely off base, I left that lab meeting with Dr. John M. Kennedy knowing that I could be brilliant the next time. So if you are ever supervising people, that is a really good thing to try to do. So straight into the camera. Thank you, Dr. John M. Kennedy. And we will go on. So my definition when I was in grad school. So I said a picture is a non-propositional visual representation on a two-dimensional plane. So we are going to call this the non-propositional definition. So what does that mean by non-propositional? Well, if you take two examples here, we have a picture of the Mona Lisa. And this is a non-propositional representation of Mona Lisa on a two-dimensional plane. Here, on the other hand, we have not a picture of Mona Lisa. And this is a propositional or statement description of the person that is depicted. So it's a Caucasian female, she's got long hair, hands folded on the lap, mysterious smile, etc., etc. This is the idea of a picture being worth 1,000 words. And you can kind of maybe combine the two. And again, Magritte might have been doing just this when he was combining propositions with images and basically putting the two into conflict. But that was my non-propositional definition. And this non-propositional definition of a picture was actually a very, very poor definition. And this is going to be my public service announcement so that you are well equipped to recognize poor definitions in any domain that you ever enter, whether it's psychology, whether it's science, whether it's sociology, history, whatever you enter in. Anytime somebody does this next thing, your red flag should go up, your alarm should sound, because it is probably a very poor definition. So the non-propositional definition was a very poor definition. And why was it a very poor definition? Well, I said a picture is a non-propositional visual representation on a two-dimensional plane, and that is a negative definition. My definition of a picture, unlike the three that were volunteered in class today, my definition of a picture was a negative definition. It said what a picture isn't. A picture is a non-propositional representation. What's missing from this definition is what a picture actually is. So it's a negative definition. It's telling you what this thing isn't. And you might think to yourself, well, that's good to know, right? I mean, that's some progress. We know what it's not. We know that it's not propositional. Isn't that something, at least the starting point? But the big problem with that is that when you have a negative definition, you probably have a circular definition, even if you don't know it. So if you started to break down this definition, you might say to yourself, well, all right, a picture is a non-propositional visual representation on a two-dimensional plane. What do you mean by non-propositional? And I would say, well, that's anything that's not linguistic. Like pictures, music, sculpture, anything that can't be said in like declarative statement form. And then what is a picture? Well, a picture is something that's non-propositional. Well, what is non-propositional? Well, it's anything that's not linguistic, like a picture. Well, what is a picture? Well, it's something that's non-propositional. Well, it's non-propositional. Well, it's anything that's like, and you get the idea. You're just going around in circles because you don't have an actual definition anywhere. You have a not this, and then that kind of just plays hot potato around that circle where you just pass it on to the next definition without ever nailing it down. So that is my public service announcement for two things. Number one, it's okay to suck when you're learning. It's okay to fall on your face every once in a while. Just make sure that the people you work with don't allow you to stay down there, and they'll bring you back up. Those are the good people. And then also, anytime somebody says, oh, the definition of blank is that it's not this, you're dealing with a definition that is going to be circular, and you're probably dealing with a domain that they are not very well equipped to tackle. All right, so enough about the not good stuff. Let's go on to some more about what a picture is. So what else do we need our definitions and our theories of picture perception to be able to account for? Well, pictures can represent lots of things. So we had some of that in the definitions here. It can represent real things. It can represent ideas. So here we have a metaphorical picture, and everybody in this class understood as soon as I put this up there that you weren't looking at literal giant ghost lions, right? The reaction to literal giant ghost lions would have been much bigger than the reaction that we got here. You would have been like, oh my gosh, ghost lions, giants, where was that? So I know never to move there. We understood. No. This isn't literal giant ghost sky lions. What they're trying to say is they're trying to communicate something like the lions are the kings of the jungle. They rule over everything. They're powerful. They're majestic. They're important, to the ecosystem. So you can represent metaphorical images. You can represent things that don't exist. And you can do that in a number of different ways, right? So we can represent a unicorn. To my knowledge, unicorns have never actually existed, and yet we can draw pictures of it. We can communicate that. So we can represent things that don't exist. We can represent things that do exist. We can represent, as some of you mentioned in your definitions, we can represent things like ideas, right? And thoughts. And we can perceive that this individual is not juggling some sort of weirdly shaped, juggling apparatus. No, this person is having, a number of different thoughts. And then one of my favorite examples of being able to depict things that you cannot see is in the Fantastic Four comics. There's a character called the Invisible Girl. She then got renamed later to the Invisible Woman. And the depictions of her across different artists is just something that could be a research study on its own, because you are literally depicting something that cannot be seen, which is invisibility. So they do it in a number of different ways. So we have translucency at the beginning of her comics, and then we have this weird outline form with a sort of sequential increase in transparency. And then very importantly, there is almost, and we'll see this come up in one of the definitions, there's almost a teaching aspect to a lot of comic books and a lot of depictions of things that are not realistic, that are not able to be seen. So for example, you might be really confused about that right panel there. And you might think to yourself, well, what is going on? She's got like a dotted outline right now. Is she glowing white? Did she turn into a ghost? Like, I don't understand what's going on. And then you read the text and it says the Invisible Girl can do it better. And you say to yourself, oh, she's invisible. I get it now. Okay, that is a depiction of invisibility. And then later on, you don't need to relearn that. You kind of just perceive it when she's sneaking up on Dr. Doom. And also there's context cues there. Why would Dr. Doom allow somebody to just approach him if he could see the dotted outline? So clearly she's invisible. This is one of my favorite because it plays with foreground and background, and you don't know, is she invisible or is he just standing in front of that perfectly blue area there? But again, pictures, importantly, can depict and you can perceive things that cannot be perceived, like invisibility. That never existed, like giant ghost lions and unicorns, and things that are not to be perceived as being literal, like the giant ghost lions. All right, and then importantly, very importantly, for how useful pictures have been, is the idea that pictures can represent space. So we have depictions. We're going to go through some depictions of space here. So here we have a square, and that is a depiction of 2D space. So 2D space is something that we have never actually encountered. We can maybe approximate two-dimensional with really, really thin, sheets of paper or gold that is hammered down to like one atom thick. But 2D doesn't actually really exist in our world. We live in a three-dimensional world, yet we can represent two-dimensional objects in a picture. We can represent a one-dimensional space, something that only has length. We can actually represent zero-dimensional space, which is just a point. It's just a location. It's just a single point that if you lived in zero-dimensional space, kind of weird, this just occurred to me. If you lived in zero-dimensional space, you would be everywhere at all times. You would just be the space. So we can represent 0D, 1D, two-dimensional spaces. Weirdly, we can even go higher. So pictures are two-dimensional, right? It's a surface that we're drawing on, and we can represent three-dimensional space by going into the space of the picture, which again should not be something that we should be able to do. And then depending upon how you want to stretch the definition of depiction, you can actually go even further and depict four-dimensional space. So much like we depicted a cube by taking that two-dimensional square and extending it into the third dimension, you can take a three-dimensional cube and extend it into the fourth dimension. And what you end up with is a tesseract. And we can't actually, maybe we'll discuss this in just a moment. It's really hard to visualize four-dimensional space. And it's really hard to visualize what a tesseract would actually do. And incidentally, don't ever build a tesseract because you'll probably end up transporting yourself across space and Meg's going to have to come and get you. And if you know that reference, you're pretty cool. All right. So anyways, we can't see the four-dimensional tesseract, but what we can do is we can take a look at images like this. And this is a three-dimensional representation of a four-dimensional tesseract rotating and intersecting our three-dimensional space. So much the same way that we can take our three-dimensional hand and we can project it, a shadow, onto a two-dimensional wall. And as you turn your hand, that shadow changes depending upon what is projected on the wall. As this four-dimensional tesseract spins, that three-dimensional shadow of the tesseract continues to change, and that's what the shadow of a tesseract would look like in three-dimensional spaces. And if your mind is blown right now, it rightfully should be, because we were not evolved to perceive 4D space. We live in a three-dimensional spatial world. Time is a fourth dimension. You can think of it that way, but we don't have a fourth spatial dimension. And I will never forget the first university statistics course I ever took. The instructor once, we were talking about dimensions, because in math, you can do as many dimensions as you want, right? So you could have a one-dimensional function, two-dimensional, three-dimensional. You can go up to like 17, 18. You can have infinite number of dimensions. And he was talking about how he would often mention it to people that we can't visualize four dimensions. And they would say, well, no, I can actually visualize four dimensions. And he told us in his class, he goes, there actually is a name for people who can visualize in four dimensions. They're called liars, because we're just not, it's not what our minds were made to do. But importantly, pictures can represent space. All right, so I mentioned that we don't have the ability to see four-dimensional space in terms of spatial, 3 dimensions of space plus a fourth spatial dimension, but we can add time to 3D to get a 4D space-time combination, and pictures can represent that. Pictures can represent time. So, for example, here we have a picture. And when you perceive this picture, when you see this picture, again, probably nobody here thought to themselves, oh my gosh, so many identical siblings. What do you call 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11? What do you call 11 identical siblings? It's like, I don't even know the root. I should have looked that up. 11ets, right? So nobody was sitting here going, oh my gosh, 11ets. I never heard of that. No, you understand that it's one girl, but she's represented at different points in time. So she's picking up the ball. She's getting ready to throw the ball. We're going to continue over here. She actually does throw the ball, sees what happens, and she is quite pleased with the result. So we understand, looking at this picture, that those multiple images represent multiple points in time, and we're able to follow the story of this girl throwing this ball, even though there's absolutely no change in the picture across time. All right, so those are some things that we need to explain. Let's start getting into it with a better definition. And I put the question mark there because it is still up for debate what exactly a picture is. But a better definition, we're going to go to Gibson, 1954. So there's that date again. And Gibson said, a faithful picture was a delimited surface so processed that it yielded a sheaf of light rays to a given point, which is the same as would be the sheaf of rays from the original scene to a given point. That is, when the adjacent order of the point of color in the cross-section of one corresponded to the adjacent order in the cross-section of the other. That's a lot. There is a lot there. So we have encountered this when we looked at the ambient optic array. What he's talking about is the ambient optic array. It would take too long to try to dissect this definition. So let's see what he was talking about in diagrammatic form. Because the core of his definition, his 1954 definition, it's called the point-by-point projection theory. And it basically has to do with perspective projection. So before we dive into that definition a little bit more, we just need to understand a little bit about perspective pictures and geometry. So perspective and the geometry of perspective, that is the master geometry that determines the information that's available to vision. So the light that is coming in and hitting your receptors at the back of your eye, the shape of that light is determined by perspective. So it's a perspective projection of a real object, like a runner, going through your pupil and then projecting on the back of your eye. And because we have that opening, the pupil, and then a projection onto a retina, that in and of itself requires that perspective geometry determines the information that's available to vision. So why is this important? Well, one of the things that Gibson requires for his definition is this idea of that perspective geometry. So let's just delve a little bit into that. We're going like layers deep here, but it'll all come together, I promise. So perspective, specifically linear perspective, was a system that was discovered by Brunelleschi during the Renaissance. So it was in the 1400s. So there's Brunelleschi right there. And just to kind of give you an idea of the kind of person that Brunelleschi was, he was oftentimes, the legend is that he was an intuitive genius. So he was very well educated, but a lot of the things that he did and a lot of the things that he figured out, he couldn't really explain why. He just kind of knew how to do it. It just sort of came to him, and he had that sort of like intuitive genius ability. So just to kind of put that into context, here's one story that sort of tells you everything you need to know about how good Brunelleschi was and how insightful he was. So this story takes place during a competition to design the dome of the Florence Cathedral in the early 1400s. So there's the finished Florence Cathedral, but in the 1400s, it looked more like this. And they needed to solve this impossible engineering problem, which was how to build this absolutely massive dome, the biggest dome that was ever built in the world. How do you build that without using the traditional wooden scaffolding, which they just didn't have the resources for, and the wood was probably not going to be strong enough. So they put out a call to the best architects in Italy, and Brunelleschi came with his plan. He came with his proposal, but he refused to fully reveal his method. He basically came with a proposal and he said, look, I can build you the dome, and I'll tell you a little bit about how I'm going to do it, but I'm not going to tell you the whole thing, right? I refuse to tell you the whole thing, but just bear in mind, I can build the dome. So they didn't believe him, and he presented the committee and the other architects with a challenge. And he said, all right, I don't want to show you my methods. Why don't we do this? We're going to have an egg balancing challenge. And whoever can make this egg stand upright on a flat marble surface will build the dome. So other architects tried and they failed, and they tried and they failed. And eventually they said to themselves, this is impossible. You can't balance this egg. And then Brunelleschi came and he took the egg and he grabbed it and he gently tapped it onto the marble surface until he slightly dented the bottom of the egg. And then he put the egg and it balanced and it stood upright. And upon seeing that, the other architects said, well, we could have done that. And Brunelleschi replied, and you could build a dome if I showed you how. So Brunelleschi, the original deal with it, he just had this kind of intuitive genius to himself. But anyways, he came up with perspective. He was the guy that worked out the geometry. And this is basically what Gibson was saying. He was saying that in a picture, what you do is you take the visual cone, you take that ambient optic array that is going to your eye, and you literally just slice it with a picture plane. And whatever is on that picture when you slice it, whatever is on that plane where you slice that visual optic array, that is what you draw, and that is what a picture is. So this is the visual cone from the New Principles of Linear Perspective by Taylor. A little bit difficult to see that, but let's get a more schematic version. So if you have a real world and you got yourself a real tree and you got yourself an observer and you got yourself a picture plane, a picture surface there, what Gibson's point-by-point projection theory says is that if you want to make a picture, what you do, and what perspective geometry says, if you want to make that picture, what you do is you take a point on that tree and you see where the light from that point would enter your eye. And that straight line from the real object to your eye, it intersects that picture surface. And where it intersects that picture surface, that's where you draw that top of the tree. And then you take a branch on the left side, and there's a point on the branch on the left side. And that point there is going to have light coming towards your eye. And that line of light is going to intersect that picture plane right there. And then we're going to have a point of light coming from the roots. And that's going to go to the observer, and it's going to intersect the picture plane right there. And then you just do that for point by point by point by point. And eventually you will have yourself a picture of a tree once you depict all those intersecting points. And that's all that perspective geometry is. It's you have this optical array, this ambient optic array in the real world. You put a picture surface in between. You reproduce on the picture surface where that optical array intersects that picture surface. And the idea is then that when that picture is there on its own, it reproduces the optical array. And that's what a picture is. It's that reproduction of the optical array that allows you to perceive because of that perspective geometry. Any questions on that? So far, so good? Okay. So leave it to Magritte to kind of take this idea and again, kind of push it through into art form. So this is called the human condition. And basically what Magritte is doing here is what I did in this schematic here, which is to say, well, imagine that an artist is drawing a realistic painting of that ocean. So this is a painting of a painting. So again, we have that idea of your mind being able to go into different worlds. But if the artist was drawing that painting, what he would do is he would basically figure out where does the light from the real world intersect that canvas, and that's where they would reproduce the paint on the canvas to imitate the light that would have been coming there. So there's the canvas right there in case it's a little bit difficult to see. But you can see that when you're in the right place, it lines up perfectly with the actual real world. So Magritte did this a few times. I think they were all called the human condition. So here we have a picture of a tree and some hills. And again, the painting lines up perfectly with the light coming in from the outside world. And then here we have one of some mountains. And this was a trend online a while back where people would take these photos and they would kind of draw in front of and put a picture in front of the actual real world. And again, you would see this point by point lining up, which is exactly what that perspective geometry is doing in a picture. And then this was a suggestion from a student last year. But this is a music video from the 80s. What they do in this video is they literally do point by point reproductions of the people in the video. And then here they have just this really cool scene where he walks in front of this window and you can see the real singer. And then he walks back and it's the drawing and he walks, goes to back and forth. So check it out. But it is all based on that point by point reproduction that is part of this point by point projection theory that we have from Gibson. So this was Gibson's first try at picture perception. And there are numerous objections to this point by point projection definition. So we'll go through a few of them. The first one has to do with things that are not realistic, like line drawings. So we have a picture here. And this is a line drawing by Roland Wright. And this is very recognizable as an airplane. And yet this has almost none of the point by point correspondence that Gibson was talking about that is in a picture. So for example, there is no correspondence to brightness. There are no bright spots. There are no dark spots. There's no shading. There's no shadow. There's no illumination source. This thing could not exist in an environment and produce that optic array. There's no point by point correspondence in color. There's no texture. There's many things missing from this picture. And yet, if you showed this to somebody and said, hey, what is this? Most people would identify and say, oh yeah, that's a picture of a plane. So clearly, this falls outside of Gibson's definition, and therefore, this point by point projection definition cannot be a complete and true definition of what a picture is. Another objection was caricatures. So we've seen these already. And the reason that we show these caricatures is because there is no point by point correspondence between the caricature on the left and Ariana Grande here on the right. There's many points that are way out of place on the one on the left, and yet we still perceive that as the same person. We still perceive Ariana Grande and her, as we saw before, invariance. So those are some objections. So we know Gibson's 1954 definition cannot be true. So maybe an even better definition came along, and this was Goodman back in 1968. And he went hard the other way. So Gibson went this is perspective projection, and it is the sort of master geometry. And Goodman went hard the other way, and he said, representations then are pictures that function in somewhat the same way as descriptions. Just as objects are classified by means of or under various verbal labels, so also are objects classified by or under various picture labels. So he was drawing an analogy that the same way that we use verbal labels to classify or label certain objects, we can also use picture labels to classify or identify various objects. And that's what a picture is. It's a bunch of picture labels. So the core of Goodman's definition is the idea that pictorial information is just symbols. It's the symbol theory of pictorial information. It's the idea that pictures are composed of symbols, and just like verbal language is composed of symbols, you basically learn to understand pictures. You learn to read pictures much the same way that you learned to read storybooks when you were a child. So one of the things that is really fascinating about this is one of the implications of this is just opens up worlds of possibilities. And that is because for the most part, language, spoken language, is arbitrary. So spoken languages are arbitrary. And if a picture is nothing but a verbal language, that would mean that pictures could be arbitrary as well. So much like we have different languages when we speak, we might have different languages when we depict things. So just to kind of nail this down, what do I mean by arbitrary? Well, here are two things that exist in the real world. And we as English speakers agreed at some point in our history, we agreed that the object on the left, we're going to call that dog. And the object on the right, we're going to call that cat. So the word dog is going to go with the one on the left. The word cat is going to go with the one on the right. But notice there's really no reason for that to have occurred. We could have just as easily decided that the one on the left is going to be called cat and the one on the right is going to be called dog. And that is just a naming convention that we came up with. So as long as everybody is in agreement, there's not going to be any sort of confusion. There's not going to be any sort of, things where somebody, says, oh, my dog, I think my dog hates me and is just waiting for me to die. And you'd be like, well, yeah, they're dogs. All dogs are evil, right? If you're a dog person, it could have been that, right? Because it's just an arbitrary naming of labels. Now, there is some parts of language that are not arbitrary. So they're called onomatopoeias, I believe. So these are words that sound like the thing they describe. So how does a bee sound? Well, bees go buzz, right? The word for buzz sounds like buzz. And weirdly, across different languages, birds, the names of birds, a lot of them are onomatopoeias. So things like the bird cuckoo, right? A cuckoo is named because they went cuckoo, right? That's the sound that they made. So sometimes it's not arbitrary, but like 99.9% of language is actually arbitrary. And then nothing, I think, drives it home more in terms of how arbitrary the words in a language can be than the fact that the word for short in English is actually longer than the word for long. So missed opportunity, but again, it just shows that there's nothing about the word short that has to have shortness in it. There's nothing about the word long that has to have longness in it. These are arbitrary things. So why is that important? Well, what Goodman is trying to say is that what a picture is, it's a visual language. It's a language that you learn. And so, for example, in this picture of the School of Athens, you learn through trial and error, through growing up with this visual language, you learn how to read this picture. So when somebody asks you, oh, that this person here, are they approximately the same size as this person up here? Notice that the person at the bottom there fills much more of that ellipse than the person further behind him. However, since we grew up reading these pictures and we know the language, what Goodman is saying is that we would say, well, okay, there's symbols in this picture, such as closer to the bottom. Closer to the bottom of a picture means closer to the observer. Higher up in the picture plane means further from the observer. large visual angle on the one at the bottom, smaller visual angle at the one at the top. So you take large visual angle near the bottom of a picture, and that is the same as smaller visual angle near the top of a picture. We learn how to read this, much like we learn how to read other symbols. And one of the really interesting things about Goodman's theory is that there's no special type of picture, right? There's no special type of picture, and there are many different sort of languages to pictures. And just the same way that native English speakers learn English, right? Every child with typical development can learn to speak the language of the culture they were born into, right? So you're a native English speaker, you're a native French speaker, and then you can also learn second languages or third languages or fourth languages. So an English speaker can learn how to speak French, French speaker can learn how to speak Russian. According to Goodman, we should be able to learn how to speak other visual languages. So if we grew up with pictures like this, if we grew up with Salvador Dali's Persistence of Memory, if we grew up with this style of painting, I just forgot. What is he? He's not, anybody want to help me out here? Surrealism. If we grew up with surrealism, we would not look at this and say to ourselves, all right, what do we got here? We got like some melty clocks, right? And like a half-formed face there. And I don't understand, like, what's going on here? If you grew up with surrealism, then you would grow up and you would say, oh, okay, I've learned how to read this. What he's trying to say is that time that was normally rigid, mechanical, measurable, that's gone soft. So time is not a fixed experience that we have. We have dreams, we have memories, we have conscious. Time stretches, it collapses, it distorts. I can read this, right? So it's a different language. It's not that realistic perspective language. And if that was the case, then it would be very easy to read all of these different pictures. And you would take a look at this and immediately know, okay, I get it. She's looking in a mirror, but it's also shaped like a skull. So beauty fades and death is inevitable. And I understand how to read this, much like you understand how to read the written word. And also, much like you learn how to read the written word, some pictures should be harder than others. Much like sometimes we read something and we're like, well, that's very clear. And then sometimes we read something like Gibson's definition from 1954, and we say to ourselves, I know those words, but going together, I don't know what they mean. That's also a possibility under Goodman's theory. So once again, this is Picasso and the painting Guernica. And this, if you showed it to somebody that learned how to read perspective pictures, and for example, Renaissance paintings, they would take a look at this and they would say, what am I looking at here? I see a light bulb. I can recognize a light bulb in the top left there. Maybe that's a horse. I really don't know what's going on here. But if you learned how to read Cubist style, if you learned how to read the language of painting that Pablo Picasso was speaking, you would take one look at this and you would say, oh man, that's a war. This is a representation of the bombing of Guernica in the Spanish Civil War. You might not know the historical context, but you would look at this and say, oh man, those people are getting messed up. This is a war, pretty violent image. The fact that we don't, or that we're not able to perceive that, means that, according to Goodman, we just don't speak this language. And that's one of the things that I alluded to when we were talking about the Invisible Woman, because in a lot of comic books, you can almost see instances where they're teaching you the visual language, right? Where they're teaching you, okay, this thing on the right, that's how we do invisible. And the next time you see that, this is the symbol for invisible. So now that you speak that symbol, now that you understand that symbol, you speak the language a little bit better. And the next time you see a picture like this of the Invisible Woman, you'll know immediately, all right, she's invisible. All right, so that was Goodman's symbol theory of pictorial information. There are objections to Goodman's theory. And the biggest objection, the biggest kind of sticking point, was what the symbol theory of pictorial information was designed to, sort of explain away, which is perspective. And the big question is whether or not the use of perspective in pictures is a convention. Is it just another arbitrary geometry that we use in a picture? It's just another kind of language, the way that English is a language. It's not sort of like a pre-existing primordial language, right, that underlies all human visual language. There is nothing about it. Is perspective just a convention? So needless to say, there are people on both sides of this fence. So some say that perspective is not a convention. So we're going to check back in with Gibson, 1960. And he said, it does not seem reasonable to assert that the use of perspective in paintings is merely a convention to be used or discarded by the painter as he chooses. When the artist transcribes what he sees upon a two-dimensional surface, he uses perspective geometry of necessity. So what Gibson was saying is that when an artist puts these patterns on a two-dimensional surface, you have to use perspective geometry in terms of where would that real object, with sending the light to your eyes, where would that light intersect that surface? It has to be what is being used. On the other hand, some people say that perspective is a convention. So Goodman doubling down and kind of getting personal here. In diametric contradiction to what Gibson says, the artist who wants to produce a spatial representation that the present day Western eye will accept as faithful must defy the laws of geometry. So he's basically saying that if you want to do something, make a painting that looks correct, that looks good, you actually have to break perspective rules. And that is true. And it's actually the case where perspective fails if your picture goes wide enough, for example. So there's a lot of rules that the Renaissance painters used to use to not make their pictures too wide. And if they did go wide, they would start breaking some rules. But you didn't have to say in diametric contradiction to what Gibson says, because grad school me said, hey, hold my beer. And that was my PhD thesis, kind of in diametric contradiction to what Goodman said. We're not going to go into this, but basically it shows where in a picture perspective is preserved and perspective starts to break down. So the white areas of tiles, that's where perspective is preserved. The gray, the dark gray and the light gray, that's where it breaks down. And basically came up with a function that is close to perspective, but not exactly as perspective. And that was published. So check it out if you are inclined, but let's keep going on. So if perspective is just a convention, so if perspective is just one language, there must be other conventions, right? You can't just have one conventional thing. There's got to be other conventions. So what might some of these other conventions be? Well, Kepps back in 1944 pointed out that one culture that had a different way of depicting space were Chinese and Japanese painters. So Chinese and Japanese painters assigned to linear perspective a diametric was just being thrown around in the painting world, in the picture perception world. Linear perspective, a diametrically opposite role from that given it by Western painters. In their system, parallel lines converge as they approach the spectator. They open up the space instead of closing it. So what he was saying was that if you take a look at Japanese art and Chinese art, they did not actually use perspective geometry. They used the opposite, the reverse of perspective geometry. So whenever you're analyzing the geometry of a series of paintings or art, it always helps if you have rigid edges. You need straight lines. So I love the Great Wave of Kanagawa, but I need straight lines. So let's find something that does have straight lines. So this is Lady Murasaki writing at her desk. And if you take a look at her desk and you extend the lines of her desk, what you'll find very subtly, but it's there, is that as the lines go off into the distance, they actually diverge, which is the opposite of what happens in linear perspective. In linear perspective, you have a vanishing point. So as lines go off into the distance, they converge to a point. In Japanese art, as lines go off into a distance, they actually diverge. They get further apart. And as Keps was saying, this opens up the space rather than closing it. And then another nice example comes from The Night Rebels of Hang Jizai. This was a very long painting, so I'm going to show you the whole thing. Get ready, here it goes. All right, we only need the end part here, so let's zoom in on that, and then I'm going to do that science fiction thing, enhance. There we go. And once again, we got tables here going off into the distance, and if you extend those lines, you can see that they actually go and diverge. They get further away from each other. So this is the opposite of linear perspective. This is inverse perspective. And it is another way of drawing pictures. It is another convention. It's not linear perspective, it's inverse perspective. It's not French, it's English. It's just another way of drawing pictures. And this was not only done by Japanese and Chinese painters. This was also done in the Renaissance. So if you go earlier than Brunelleschi, you will see this same sort of geometry being used. So here in the Annunciation Church of St. Clement in Ohrid, we have various architectural features here. And if you extend those lines, you can see that as they go off into the distance, they diverge, they don't converge, and they don't converge to a single spot either. So they diverge as they go off into the distance. So it would seem that there is this, at the very least, one other convention, this inverse perspective convention. But then the key question is there any difference between linear perspective and inverse perspective? Is there some critical thing that one of them can do and the other one cannot? So it would be almost like saying, well, all languages are just conventions. And then you come along and you say, well, I have a language, but I can't talk about the past. My language does not have the ability to talk about the past. I don't have a past tense. Well, somebody would say, well, your language really isn't a complete language, right? It's not, it can't describe everything that we need it to describe. So it's not just different than other languages, it's actually worse than other languages. It's not as good as other languages. Other languages are superior or better or more well constructed than your particular language. So that's the idea here. Is linear perspective somehow better at something than inverse perspective? And the one big difference that only linear perspective has, to my knowledge, is that linear perspective is systematic, inverse perspective is not. And what do I mean by systematic? I mean that linear perspective can depict anything without contradicting its visual space. Inverse perspective cannot. So I'll give you an example of inverse perspective failing. So this is the Trinity, also called the Hospitality of Abraham by Andrei Rublev. And this is drawn in inverse perspective. And what happens in this picture is that there are breakdowns in this painting of the space in the painting. So in the real world, you might have three angels. They're sitting around a table. They're on chairs. They have their feet on footstools. But if you take a look at the details of this painting, some weird stuff starts to happen, such as the end of that footstool is not on the ground. It's somehow floating weirdly in midair. So is that one over there. And another thing that you will notice when you start to analyze these paintings is that the artist knew that, for example, inverse perspective was not systematic, because the places where contradictions would occur, the places where a chair would start to occupy the same space as the table, because they're both diverging and they're diverging into each other's space, well, those tend to be covered up. So you just place the angel in front of it, And now we don't need to know who wins the battle of table versus chair in claiming that space. So the places where that would occur, you basically cover that space up so that you don't reveal the fact that those rules needed to be broken. So inverse perspective cannot depict every single situation. Inverse perspective failed, depicting 3 individuals sitting around a table. On the other hand, linear perspective can do everything. So you take a look at the Last Supper here, and we have 13 individuals all sitting on the same side, and none of them are occupying each other's space. None of them are colliding with each other. We don't have to cover up certain areas of this because things have, rules have been broken. Legs aren't floating off the floor. The table's not, floating off the floor. Everything fits, right? All the tiles, all the ceilings, all the, the things on the wall, everything fits with everything else. And that is the one thing that linear perspective has. It is systematic. Anything that exists in the real world can be depicted without breaking rules with linear perspective. And as far as I know, it is the only convention that allows that to happen. All right. So our final definition, the betterer definition. This came from Gibson, 1971. And he mentioned or surmised that a picture is a surface so treated that a delimited optic array to a point of observation is made available that contains the same kind of information that is found in the ambient optic arrays of an ordinary environment. So the big move that he made here is he dropped that point by point correspondence. And he said, instead of just saying you have to match up point by point, what you need to do is you need to contain the same kind of information. And it doesn't matter how you contain that information, whether it's point by point or some other way, but as long as that same information is contained in the ambient optic array of an ordinary environment, as long as that's in your picture, then you have a successful picture. So this is the idea of the pictures as information definition. And this is the optical information that your visual system picks up that specifies the properties of the world. So we'll end today with this idea before we get into the objections. So we'll let this one sit in your mind for a while. But my favorite explanation of this definition that I've ever seen, this pictures as information definition, came from my favorite stand-up comedian of all time, which is Mitch Hedberg. So unfortunately, he left us in 2005. But if you've never seen him before, go check him out. He is one of these just comedic geniuses. So just some of his jokes. He goes, I tried to throw away a yo-yo. It was effing impossible. I once saw a forklift lit the crate of forks, and it was way too literal for me. P.S. This is what part of the alphabet would look like if Q and R were eliminated. And he has this really awesome delivery. But he explains this pictures as information theory, probably the best I've ever seen. So without further ado, Mitch Hedberg.
Swiss cheese is the only cheese you can draw with a pencil that's still identifiable. No other cheese is like that. You can try to draw America with a pencil, but someone's going to think it's cheddar. The Swiss cheese is for sure. That's Swiss. Yes, it is.
All right, so Swiss cheese is the only cheese that you can draw with a pencil and a paper. That is pictures as information. So what he is saying is that if you drew this, you are not giving enough information to identify that. So that could be a slice of cheddar. That could be a slice of American. That could be a piece of cake. That could be that little piece in the Trivial Pursuit game that you fill in your moving piece with when you get certain categories. That could be a number of different things. It does not contain the picture. It does not contain the information required. However, that's Swiss cheese because that contains the information. So this is the idea behind why we're able to perceive pictures that look like this are just pencil and paper drawings, because they preserve the information that you would get in the real world that specifies that particular object. So that is why we can perceive this tiger, even though it's a point-by-point perspective projection, it still contains that invariant information. That's why this thing looks like a plane, because it still contains that information. That's why Ariana Grande's caricature on the left is recognizable as Ariana Grande on the right. And, we're very close to actually wrapping this up. So I lied. We're going to plow through just real quick. So this is probably the most well able to account for many of the things in picture perception that we can do. However, it's not finished. Psychology is not done. There are objections to this pictures as information definition. And the big objection is metaphorical pictures. So pictures that do not contain the same kind of information that is found in the ambient optic array of an ordinary environment, because the things that it depicts have never been found in the ambient optic array of an ordinary environment. So when you were able to perceive this and you knew it wasn't giant ghost lions and you knew it was metaphoric, Gibson's pictures as information definition should not allow you to do that, because you have never encountered anything like this in the environment. This has never existed. And yet you take a look at it and you say, oh, I get it. Majestic lions, kings of all that they survey, very powerful. And the weird thing is that Gibson can explain why you can see a unicorn, even though they don't exist, because you've seen horses, you've seen horns, those exist in the real world. So the information that they go together is presented there. But it's just this really weird thing where we have real objects on the left there, and we have a fictional object on the right, but that left picture, that is a metaphorical image, because that does not happen in the real world. And because it does not happen in the real world and it does not depict something that is happening in the real world, the right side is a literal image, because if unicorns existed, that's what they would look like. So it's a fictional object, but a literal image, real object, but metaphorical images. How do these metaphorical images work? That is what we're going to do next time. So next class is going to be dedicated to a study that I did with a former student here at Indiana University, analysis of motions in comic book cover art using pictorial metaphors. So we're going to dive into the idea of metaphors, how they're processed, how they work. So do try to read this before next class. If you struggle with it, that's fine. Struggling is part of the process. But do give it a go. Do give it a run through. And anything that does not make sense, put a pin in it. Kind of write down, a little note to yourself. We will go over this entire study next time, and it will make a lot more sense when we do if you try to first pass before next class. So any final questions before we wrap up? I can't believe we actually finished on time. But that is it for today. I'll see you all next time.